Last weekend I was able to get away for a little bit and visit friends and my sons who live in the same neighborhood that I pastored in 20-some years ago up in Queens Village in Queens, New York. And we had a very nice time. We went out to dinner. And I have to admit, as I was sitting across the table for them, reflecting on, kind of driving into the neighborhood and seeing how it's changed over the years from when I was last there, but also just seeing my children that have, that I've watched from babies, infants, all the way now to really young men in their mid and late 20s. I find myself getting more concerned about the world that I will be leaving to them. The generation that is up and coming, what will I leave behind? Will it be a world that's better than it was when I was growing up in their age? Will it be safer? Will it be more loving, more compassionate, more caring? So I find myself thinking a lot about the next generation, the generation that has been entrusted to me and to many of us. As a pastor, of course, that's always great concern, and I always want to try to learn about the younger generations. And so this past week I was reading an article about millennials. Millennials would be those kids in their 20s, in their 20s and 30s. And it was kind of encouraging in this article to read that as they studied and they asked questions and they do surveys of this generation, they find some really interesting things out about them. This is a generation that gets inspired by the things that are around them and the ways in which they can make a difference. They get inspired by inspiring people, by passionate people. People that are passionate, they want to be a part of that. They want to experience that. And they also are spiritual. Now, they might not necessarily be institutional spiritual related to a certain congregation or to a certain church, but they are inquisitive. They want to learn more about God. They want to learn more about Jesus. They're intrigued by the stories that are in the Bible and how they might relate to their own life. And they want to see movement. They want to see growth. They want to see change. They're not afraid of change because, quite frankly, their whole life has been one of change. They're not surprised that next year Apple will come out with a new iPhone. They expect it. My wife still wonders what was wrong with her old flip phone. But this is a generation that expects rapid changes constantly. They are willing to take risks rather than be just comfortable in certainty. And they're also a generation that are generous. They're generous with their time. They're generous with their talents and even with their resources, especially if it connects with what I said before, if it's something that they can be really excited about and passionate about. This is the generation that goes on mission trips, as we've seen from our own youth when they go down to New Orleans or down to Houston to help people who are in great need. So what are your hopes for the next generation as you reflect on that? The generation of your family or of our church family? The generation that will be coming next. Well, this is the 7th sermon in a 7-week series on Dynasty. And this week in particular, we're looking at some generational change. The first 6 weeks we've been talking about King David, and now David, we hear, has died, and the mantle has been given to his son Solomon, which is no hard task. I mean, he is now successor to the most beloved king of the Old Testament, the greatest king of Israel. And he has big shoes in which to step in. David is the one who unified the kingdom, north and south. He expanded the boundaries of the kingdom as he was a warrior king who defeated Israel's enemies, and now they're living in a time of relative peace. He's reigned for 40 years, a generation itself. And that is why when he dies, the people say, there has never been anyone like King David. And then here's Solomon, the youngest of David's sons. Not even the favorites. Pastor Brock gave a great sermon last week about a couple of his other sons that were more favored than Solomon. But he does have a quality that his other brothers did not possess. Like his father before him, Solomon is responsive to seeking God and walking in his ways. And because of that, God's gracious hand is upon him. And he is chosen to be king, to lead the chosen people of God. In our story, he goes to one of the high places, Gibeon. There were a number of shrines that are in the high places of Israel that the Israelites would worship. This is before the temple was established. Now, Solomon, within 4 or 5 years of his reign, will build a temple, and then all of the sacrifices will move from those high places to the temple. But in the meantime, he goes to this high place of Gibeon, where the Ark of the Covenant formerly resided before King David brought it to Jerusalem, and he offers an extravagant sacrifice. We know it's extravagant because he said it's recorded that there are 1,000 burnt offerings. That is one big barbecue. Okay? And while he's there, he offers thanksgiving to everything that God had done for his father David, and also for him. But then he also seeks God's blessing. Solomon understands that if he's going to take on this great responsibility, he is going to need the blessing of God. Because with great blessing comes great responsibility. And that is, after all, why we expect more from our elected officials, or our religious leaders, or cultural icons, or sports figures. And that's also why we experience tremendous disappointment when they fail. I don't know about you, but my heart is breaking for our brothers and sisters in the Roman Catholic Church, struggling with pedophile priests who broke their vows against innocent children. And it's not just them. This scandal has happened in many different denominations. The story goes on and tells us that as he is sleeping, the Lord appears to him in a dream. Now, for modern people, when we think of dreams, we usually don't think too much about them. That's why we have a phrase, well, it's only a dream. It's only a dream. Oh, that was bad. Oh, it's only a dream. Don't worry about it. But for people of the Bible, dreams were one of the ways that they believed that God was speaking to them. God was revealing his will to them through these dreams. And in the dream, God inquires of Solomon, ask what I should give you. Ask what I should give you. Now, this is the equivalent of hitting the lottery, okay? Or finding a genie in a bottle, and the genie, puffs out and goes, make a wish. But instead of saying, well, I wish I had 1,000 more wishes, or I wish I had $1 billion, or I wish I was, the ultimate power in the universe, Solomon instead asks God for what he desperately needs if he is going to be able to lead his people as their king. He asks for the wisdom that only God can give. What he asks for is nothing less than spiritual discernment, of a better understanding of God and God's ways. He understands that to discern God and to discern the ways of God, one needs that spiritual discernment to consciously seek God's direction in one's life. To submit one's own way of thinking to God's way of thinking, which is figuring out the difference between good and evil, right and wrong, what's important and what's not important. Now, a couple thousand years later, Martin Luther will do the same thing, and he'll come up with a phrase, adiaphora. Adiaphora means not essential for salvation. In other words, a lot of times, Luther saw that the church would get all riled up about things that were not essential for salvation. What he's trying to say is that there are things that go on in our church life, in our community life, that really are not, well, they're just not that important as it relates to who we are as people of God. And yet, how often have you heard about churches having fights or breaking up because of these adiaphora? They painted the bathroom purple. Oh my gosh, I can't go there anymore, right? They're singing a certain song. I'm out of here, right? Adiaphora, not essential for salvation. It's important if you want to live a life of wisdom, to live a life of discernment. To listen, but also then to do and act upon what God says. To learn and study His Word in the Bible. God's response to Solomon is to give him what he asks for, but also what he doesn't ask for. In other words, those riches and the power and the influence, those are also given to Solomon, not because he asks for them, that God blesses him abundantly due to Solomon's humility. He, in essence, becomes a vision of what a good king is like. And indeed, he becomes the model for what we view as the Messiah, that ultimate king, which Jesus then takes on for himself. He takes that mantle on himself. Jesus, after all, walked in the ways of God with deep and profound humility. Ask what I should give you. What would you dare ask for from God? Would you ask for patience? Or hope? Love? Justice? Compassion? Maybe to be free from pain or suffering? Perhaps blessing or understanding? What would you ask for, not only for yourself, but also for the next generation? When my kids were in elementary school and middle school, we would drive them to school, or if they were getting on the bus, I would always say this Latin phrase to them as they were getting on the bus, carpe diem pro Deo. Now, you might recognize the first two words, carpe diem. It means seize the day. Pro Deo means for God. So, seize the day for God. What I wanted them to do is I wanted them to listen to the ways of God. I wanted them to really reflect on what God might be doing in their life and in the life of the world. And I wanted them to seek to understand that in their own life. But then I also wanted them to seize it. I wanted them to act upon it. Not just take it in and let it sit there, but actually act upon it. I wanted them to make the world, our community, our family, our church, our country better. Abiding in God to be a blessing. Focusing on the things that really matter. And understanding and discerning that will of God. So that they could, in turn, pass on to their generation, to the next generation. A world, a country, a community, a family, a church that humbly walks in the ways of God. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.